The morning they mocked her, she was 8 months pregnant. She walked into that courthouse alone. No husband beside her, no family in the front row. Just her belly, and an attorney nobody took seriously.
This is for the
Harlan
child,
Voss's
Caroline.
legal team was already laughing before she reached
Judith.
the door. His girlfriend stood
know
in the
what to
lobby
say.
in a red dress and whispered something behind her hand. His attorney laughed out loud. On the marble floor of a federal courthouse. Out loud. They looked at her belly, and they saw desperation. They saw a woman who had nothing left. They were wrong. What they could not see, what nobody in that building knew, except Caroline and her attorney, was that she was carrying the one thing that would collapse Harlan Voss's entire legal strategy in a single afternoon. Not a document, not a witness, not a secret recording. She was carrying his only heir. And his dying father had spent the last year of his life making absolutely certain that fact would protect her. Stay with this story. Because what happens in that courtroom will remind you of something you may have forgotten. That the people who laugh at you in the lobby are never the ones who see what you're actually carrying. The lesson this story carries: when they underestimate you, let them. Your silence is not weakness, it is strategy. And the woman who walks in quietly is very often the one who walks out, changed everything. What this story is really about. This is not a story about money, or courtrooms, or billionaire families. This is a story about a woman who was dismissed, humiliated, and nearly broken, and who chose, again and again, to keep walking forward anyway. It is about what it means to carry your dignity into a room that does not want to give it back to you. And it is about the quiet, permanent power of being exactly who you are when everyone expects you to fold. If you have ever been laughed at, if you have ever been underestimated, if you have ever stood in a room where nobody believed you were enough, this story is for you. If this story moved you, if you felt even one moment of recognition, please like this video, leave a comment below telling us which part hit you hardest, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one. We are here every week with stories about women who chose themselves when no one else would.
The heels on the marble floor made a sound like a clock counting down. Sharp, deliberate, each step measured. Caroline Merritt was 34 years old. She was 8 months and 3 weeks pregnant. She was walking into the most important legal battle of her life, wearing a charcoal maternity dress and flat shoes, because heels no longer fit her swollen feet. She knew how she looked. She had stood in front of the bathroom mirror that morning for a long time. She had looked at the dark circles under her eyes. She had looked at her belly, round and low and undeniable. She had looked at her own face and said, out loud, to herself, "You are ready." She was almost ready. The courthouse lobby in downtown Chicago was cold the way expensive buildings always are. Not temperature cold, status cold. The kind of cold that has nothing to do with air conditioning and everything to do with who belongs and who doesn't. Caroline belonged. She had decided that on the drive over. Getting everyone else to understand it was the entire point of today. She had checked her phone 3 times before getting out of the car. She locked the screen, unlocked it, locked it again, then once more, not because anyone was going to call, not because she was expecting a message, just because her hands needed something to do that wasn't shaking. She put the phone in her bag. She got out of the car. She walked. The lobby opened up ahead of her. Marble floors, high ceilings. The particular silence of a place designed to make ordinary people feel small. She had been to this courthouse 6 times over the past 4 months. She no longer felt small here. She felt something else, something harder and quieter than small. Harlan's legal team was already assembled near the elevator bank. Preston Alcott stood at the center. He was 60 years old, built like a man who had won too many arguments and eaten too many celebratory dinners afterward. He was holding a coffee cup in one hand and talking to someone beside him. Talking and laughing. The particular laugh of a man who expects today to go exactly the way he planned it. And beside Preston stood Delia Ashworth, 29 years old, red dress, the kind of red that announces itself before the person wearing it has even walked into the room. Delia was Harlan's girlfriend, fiancée, technically, as of 3 months ago. Caroline had read about the engagement in a lifestyle column. She had read it on her phone at 2 in the morning while sitting up in bed with her hand on her belly, and she had felt something she could not name. Not jealousy, not exactly, something older and more complicated than jealousy. Delia saw her first. She saw Caroline's belly, and she said something behind her hand to Preston. Preston looked over. He laughed, not quietly. The sound carried across the marble lobby the way sounds do in spaces designed for acoustics. Caroline heard every note of it. She felt her jaw tighten. She felt something shift in her chest, something lower and quieter than anger. She had loved Harlan Voss for 9 years. She had built his household. She had managed the philanthropic arm of his foundation from a scattered charitable gesture into a nationally recognized institution. She had learned which of his board members drank too much at dinner and needed to be steered away from difficult conversations. She had memorized the names of their wives and children. She had written his speeches. She had smiled at his parties. She had done all of it without a single public credit. And now she was 8 months pregnant with his child, walking through this lobby, and she was the punchline. She walked past them without speaking. Her attorney was waiting by the courtroom door. Margaret Calloway was 49 years old and looked like someone's most reliable English teacher. Sensible blazer, reading glasses on a chain, a briefcase that had been to a great many battles and showed it. Margaret looked at Caroline's face and understood everything. "They're laughing," Caroline said. "Good," Margaret said. "Laughing people make mistakes." They went in. The courtroom filled slowly. Harlan arrived at 9 minutes before the hour, flanked by Preston and 2 junior associates. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He was 52 years old and had aged beautifully, the way men with money and good genetics tend to age. Distinguished, silver-templed, the kind of face that read as authority in boardrooms and courtrooms and anywhere else authority needed to be projected. He sat at his table. He folded his hands. His expression was professionally neutral. He did not look at Caroline. Then once, he did. His eyes moved to her belly. She watched him. She watched his face. She looked for guilt, and she did not find it. What she found was something else. Calculation. The rapid, precise assessment of a man who is running numbers in his head. That was when she knew for certain he still didn't understand what she was carrying. Not just a baby, a legal reality that his entire legal team had somehow missed, that his own father had quietly constructed, piece by piece, over the final year of his life. He didn't know yet. That was her only advantage. She intended to keep it as long as possible. Judge Eleanor Harwick entered the courtroom at exactly 9 o'clock. The room rose. The room sat. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The court reporter placed her fingers on her machine. Caroline placed her right hand on the table in front of her. She placed her left hand on her belly. She thought, "I know what I'm carrying. I know exactly what it means." They don't yet. The case was formally styled as Voss versus Merritt Voss. Asset division following the dissolution of a 9-year marriage. That title did not capture what was actually at stake. What was actually at stake was the entire Voss family inheritance structure. the dying wishes of a patriarch, a child not yet born, and whether Caroline walked away with dignity or with nothing. Judge Harwick looked at both tables. She said, "We'll begin with opening statements. Mr. Alcott." Preston stood. He smiled the smile of a man about to perform, and Caroline breathed in and breathed out and waited. Preston Alcott performed. There was no other word for it. He moved around the front of the courtroom with the ease of a man who had done this so many times that the space itself felt familiar to him. He spoke about the Voss prenuptial agreement in tones of practiced, sorrowful finality, as though it were a natural law, as though its terms were simply the weather. The agreement had been drafted 2 months before the wedding. It had been signed by Caroline at 25 years old. She had a law degree she had barely used. She had been in love for the first time in the way people are in love when they are 25. And the person they love is a powerful, brilliant, compelling man who makes them feel chosen. She had signed it. Preston laid out the terms with the care of a surgeon. $1.2 million and the Charleston townhouse. That was the settlement. 9 years of marriage, and that was the agreement she had signed. He said it with something that almost sounded like sympathy. He sat down. Margaret rose. She walked to the lectern slowly. She placed both hands flat on its surface. She was quiet where Preston had been theatrical. She did not pace. She did not perform. She stood completely still, and she spoke in a voice like someone closing a door on a long argument. She said that the prenuptial agreement contained a specific clause, Clause 14, the heir provision. She said it simply. She did not dramatize it. She let the words do the work. In the event that Caroline Merritt Voss bore a biological child of Harlan Voss's bloodline, the prenuptial terms would be superseded not by a competing contract, by something older and more fundamental, by the founding trust of the Voss family estate, established in 1981 by Theodore Voss Sr. The trust named the bearer of the first biological Voss grandchild as the protected party in all family legal proceedings. The room went quiet. Margaret let it sit. The silence lasted 8 full seconds. Caroline counted them. Then Preston was on his feet. He said that Harlan Voss had no biological children, that this had been medically established. He said it with the crisp confidence of a man citing a fact he has confirmed many times. Margaret nodded pleasantly. She said that was correct. As of the date of their marriage, and through most of its duration, Harlan Voss had been documented as infertile, low motility, confirmed by a specialist. She paused here with precise timing. She said the word, however. She did not finish the sentence. She sat down. The hook was set. Caroline watched Harlan's face across the room. She watched for the moment he understood. It didn't come. Not yet. His face remained composed. He leaned toward Preston and said something quietly. Preston shook his head slightly. They had not been prepared for Clause 14. She could see that in the geometry of their posture. Good, she thought. Let them recalculate. The preliminary motions took the rest of the morning. Forms submitted, objections noted, the language of the law moving like a machine that had been running long before anyone in this room was born and would continue long after. During a brief recess, Carolyn sat in the hallway on a wooden bench. Nora Whitfield was there with a paper bag of food Caroline probably wouldn't eat, and the particular expression Nora wore when she was actively restraining herself from saying something. Go ahead, Caroline said. I wasn't going to say anything. You were. I was going to say that Preston's face, during Margaret's opening statement, was the most satisfying thing I have witnessed in a professional setting in my entire adult life. Caroline almost smiled. He'll recover. Obviously, but for those 8 seconds. Nora pressed her hand briefly over her heart. Beautiful. Caroline looked down at her hands. She was thinking about the timeline again. She had been thinking about it since the hearing began, running the numbers. She had missed her period in late July. She had taken the test in early August. She had been holding that information alone, unsure what it meant for a marriage that had already been growing cold for 2 years, when the divorce papers arrived in late August. He had filed papers knowing she had missed her period. He might not have known she was pregnant, but the timing was not an accident. Something in him had known the marriage was ending, had sensed she might be pregnant, had moved to file, before anything complicated the clean lines of the prenuptial. He knew. He must have known something. She thought, I was so naive. For so long. I kept thinking the coldness was stress. I kept thinking the distance was his workload. I kept explaining him to myself in the most generous possible terms for years. The signs were all there. She just hadn't wanted to read them. Nora was watching her. You're doing the timeline again, Nora said. I'm not. Your jaw does a specific thing. Caroline looked up. He filed papers knowing I was probably pregnant. He filed anyway because he thought the prenuptial covered everything. He thought Clause 14 didn't matter because he had medical documentation of infertility. But he was retested, Nora said quietly. This was something Griffin Cole had told them 3 days ago, quietly, over the phone. He was retested 18 months into our marriage. The original diagnosis was wrong. He is fertile. He never told me. He never told anyone. She paused. He never told his own lawyers. Nora was quiet for a moment. So they've been building their whole case on a medical fact that isn't true, she said. And I've been building mine on one they don't know about yet, Caroline said. Back inside, Margaret requested a 10-day recess to submit additional documentation. Preston objected with considerable theater. The judge granted it, with the mild efficiency of someone who had seen this particular performance before. As the room emptied, Preston passed Caroline in the aisle. He slowed. He looked at her with something that might have been genuine. He said, almost gently, You should take the 1.2, sweetheart. This only gets harder from here. She looked at him without changing her expression. She did not reply. Outside, in the cold November air, Nora appeared beside her and took her arm. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Nora's phone buzzed. She looked at it. Her face changed. What? Caroline said. It wasn't a question. My contact at the estate. Nora's voice was careful. Theodore Voss Sr. died 4 days ago. The death hasn't been publicly announced yet. The family is managing the timing of the statement. Caroline stopped walking. Theodore was dead. Theodore, who had been frail for a year, who had pulled her aside at his 80th birthday gathering on the Nantucket porch, who had looked at her with those sharp gray eyes and said something she had filed away without fully understanding. Theodore, who had been the only member of the Voss family who ever made her feel like she genuinely belonged there. Theodore was dead. His estate was now in motion, and the trust clause, the heir provision, had just become active. She stood on the courthouse steps in the cold, and she felt the weight of it all shift, like tectonic plates, slow and enormous and impossible to stop. Everything changes now, she said. Everything changes now, Nora agreed. Nora handed her the phone. The photograph on the screen showed a document, cream paper, dense legal language, a signature at the bottom. In a hand Caroline recognized. Theodore's bold, slightly trembling late-life signature, the one he'd had since the Parkinson's diagnosis. It was a codicil to his estate trust, dated 8 months ago. Caroline read it in the courthouse bathroom, sitting on the closed lid of the seat in the end stall, her bag on her lap, her hands completely steady in the way hands sometimes go steady when the body understands that shaking is not an option right now. The codicil named her Caroline Merritt Voss, full legal name. It referenced her specifically. It referenced the child she carried. It referenced the heir provision of the original trust, and it clarified, in Theodore's precise language, that his intention had always been for the first biological Voss grandchild to be protected under the full terms of the estate. Not $1.2 million, not a townhouse, the full terms. She read it twice. She folded the phone and gave it back to Nora under the stall door. She sat in the cold bathroom for 3 minutes and she thought about Theodore Voss Sr. She thought about the Nantucket porch. She thought about the gray-haired man at the foundation gala 2 months before she found out she was pregnant. A brief, seemingly insignificant exchange. He had said something about the foundation's future. She had thought it was small talk. It was not small talk. Dr. Sandra Rowe, Caroline's obstetrician, had also been Theodore's personal physician for 30 years. When the pregnancy was confirmed, that information had reached Theodore. And Theodore, dying and clear-eyed and deeply worried about what his son was capable of, had acted. He had called his attorney Walter Crane. He had added the codicil. He had made sure the door existed. He could not stop Harlan from destroying the marriage, but he could make sure his granddaughter had a floor to stand on. He did what Harlan wouldn't. The thought arrived with a force that surprised her. She felt it in her chest. Not grief. Something more complex. Gratitude and sadness braided together. She stood up. She walked out of the stall. She washed her hands and looked at herself in the mirror. She thought, he left me a weapon. The question is whether I'm willing to use it, knowing what it costs. She already knew the answer. The memories came in the car on the way home. She had stopped trying to prevent them. They came when they wanted to, flooding in at the worst moments with perfect sensory detail. Harlan in the early years. The Malibu kitchen on a Saturday morning, sunlight coming through the glass doors, him reading the paper while she made coffee. The specific domestic piece of that scene. She had loved those mornings. She had loved the version of him that existed in those mornings. She remembered the moment she gave up her career. It had not felt like sacrifice at the time. He had said, "The foundation needs someone I trust completely." He had said, "Nobody understands what I'm trying to build the way you do." He had said it in a way that made her feel chosen, rather than useful. She had chosen to feel chosen. 2 years later, standing in the bedroom doorway, watching her pack for a Washington trip, he had said quietly, "Don't forget who made this possible." She had smiled. She had not heard what was underneath it. She heard it now. The good memories were the worst ones. They didn't heal clean. They left a specific kind of ache, the ache of knowing that something was real and also that it wasn't enough, that real and good are not the same as safe and permanent. She had built a life inside someone else's architecture. She had made it beautiful. And when he decided to demolish it, he had done so with the efficiency of a man who had simply been waiting for the right moment. I was so stupid, she thought, not because she had loved him, not because she had built things with him, but because she had believed that her contribution was visible to him. She had believed he saw what she gave. He saw it. He just didn't think it entitled her to anything. Nora called at 6 in the evening. "Margaret needs to know about the codicil tonight," she said. "We have the recess, but we can't waste it." "I know. And there's something else. Griffin Cole reached out to Margaret's office. He says he has information. He wants to meet with you directly. No lawyers." Carolyn was quiet. "He was Theodore's person," Nora said. "He and Theodore had a relationship separate from the business. I think he's trying to keep a promise. Set up the meeting, Caroline said. She arrived home. The townhouse was quiet. She had not fully unpacked in 6 months. There were boxes in the hallway she had been stepping around every single day, the boxes she kept meaning to deal with and never quite did. She stopped in front of them. She stood there for a moment, then she started opening them, not all of them, just the ones in the hallway. She took out the books and put them on the shelves. She took out the framed photographs and leaned them against the wall to decide about later. She took out the kitchen things she had packed from the primary residence when she moved out, and she carried them to the kitchen and she put them away. It was 11 at night before she stopped. The hallway was clear. She stood in it and looked at the floor where the boxes had been, and she felt something she had not expected. Not resolution, something smaller and more immediate than that. Just the specific satisfaction of having made a space into what it was supposed to be. Thumps. She went to bed at 11:30. She lay on her side, with a pillow between her knees, the way Dr. Rowe had told her to. The baby moved, a slow rolling motion, like a question being considered. She placed her hand on her side and stayed very still. She thought, Theodore built a door. He built it for you. We're going to walk through it. She slept. Margaret's office smelled like coffee and printer paper and the particular organized urgency of a deadline approaching. They sat across from each other at Margaret's desk at 8 in the morning, 3 days into the recess. The codicil was on the table between them in a clear sleeve. Margaret had read it 4 times. She had the expression she wore when something was very good and also very complicated. Walter Crane, Margaret said, Theodore's attorney. The man who drafted and witnessed the codicil, 81 years old, lives outside Burlington, Vermont, has not responded to any legal communication from either side. She paused. He is the only person who can definitively authenticate Theodore's mental competency at signing. Without him, Harlan's team will argue that Theodore was in cognitive decline, that the codicil was improperly influenced, that it doesn't reflect genuine intent. But it does. It absolutely does. And we can argue that with Judith Voss's testimony about what Theodore told her, but Crane is the foundation. Margaret tapped the sleeve. We need Crane. Caroline nodded. What's stopping us from reaching him? He's 81, he's in Vermont, and he has refused all contact since Theodore died. He was Theodore's person for 50 years. He may be grieving. He may be protecting himself from a legal battle he doesn't want at his age. Margaret looked at her. We have 7 days of recess left. Then we find a way. The pantry needed reorganizing. She knew this was not rational. She knew this was a coping mechanism Nora had gently identified approximately 47 times over the years. When Caroline was overwhelmed, she organized. She made order in small spaces because the large spaces were too complicated. It was 11 at night, and the pantry was coming out onto the counter. Cans lined up by size on the kitchen island. Jars grouped by type. The shelf paper slightly crinkled at one corner, and she smoothed it flat with the heel of her hand. The light over the stove was warm. Outside, the November wind pushed against the kitchen window. She worked in the specific silence of late-night domestic focus, the refrigerator hum, the occasional car on the street outside, the soft weight of the baby shifting as she bent and straightened. Her phone rang at 11:43. Are you reorganizing? Nora asked. The pantry needed it. Caroline? I'm fine. You are alphabetizing soup. A pause. Then something in Caroline's chest gave way, and she started laughing. It lasted about 15 seconds. Then it tipped sideways into something else for about 30 seconds. Then it leveled back out. I'm okay, she said. I know you are, Nora said. I just wanted to hear you say it. The soup cans went back onto the shelf. Caroline stood in the kitchen at midnight with both hands on the counter. The baby pressed against her ribs from inside. The lavender hand soap Nora had brought sat by the sink. The kitchen smelled like the lemon pound cake she had baked 2 days ago and not finished. She thought, I'm not losing this. I'm just tired. Tired is not the same as losing. The next morning, Margaret called with news that landed like cold water. Harlan's team had learned about the codicil. They had filed an emergency motion challenging its validity. Their argument, Caroline had manipulated an elderly dying man. Their plan? Discredit the document and her before the recess ended. Preston Alcott was going to call it elder exploitation. Caroline sat at the kitchen table with her phone in her hand, and she read Margaret's message twice. They had gone after Theodore's memory. They were going to stand in front of a judge and say that this good, deliberate, clear-eyed man had been confused and manipulated in the last months of his life. Something moved through her chest. Not exactly cold, something more precise than cold. She called Margaret back immediately. The photographs from the Foundation Gala, she said. The ones showing me speaking with Walter Crane? How long has Harlan's team had those? They submitted them this morning as evidence of premeditated conspiracy. A pause. They're arguing you cultivated the codicil deliberately, that you befriended Crane at the gala to engineer what followed. Caroline was quiet. The gala was 14 months ago, she said. 2 months before I got pregnant. I know. They're going to argue I planned a pregnancy for financial gain before I was even pregnant. Yes. She breathed in. She breathed out. She said, Margaret, they are going to stand in that courtroom and say that I strategically became pregnant as a financial maneuver while married to a man I had been with for 9 years, in a marriage that was still legally intact, and that the baby I am now carrying at 34 weeks is a calculated move. That is the argument, yes. Let them make it. A silence. I'm sorry, Margaret said. Let them make that argument in front of a judge. Let them say, on the record, that I deliberately became pregnant to exploit a dying man's trust documents. Let them say that about me. Let the record show that. Her voice was very steady. Because then the record will also show everything they did in response to that imaginary conspiracy. The subpoenaed medical records, the turning of an 81-year-old attorney, the tabloid stories, all of it will be on the record as their response to a pregnancy. Margaret was quiet for 4 full seconds. Then she said, I see what you're doing. Good. I'd like to say I would have thought of that. You would have, Caroline said. I just got there first. She put the phone down. She placed both hands flat on the kitchen table. She was not going to cry. She was not going to be afraid. She was going to walk back into that courtroom in 7 days, and she was going to be the most composed person in the room. Not because she was not hurt, not because she was not exhausted, because the most important thing she could give her daughter was the memory of a mother who didn't flinch. Griffin Cole was not a comfortable man. He sat at Caroline's kitchen table on a Tuesday evening and held a coffee mug with both hands and looked like someone in the process of paying a debt he had owed for a long time. He was 41. He had the look of a man who worked hard and slept less than he should and had made choices he thought about often. He said, Theodore called me 3 weeks before he died. Caroline waited. He asked me a direct question. He said, when it matters, will you do the right thing? I said yes. He looked at his coffee. I'm here because of that conversation. What do you need to tell me? She asked. He told her in order. He was precise. He clearly wanted to get through this and have it be done. First, Harlan had himself medically retested 18 months into their marriage. The original infertility diagnosis had been based on a flawed test. The retest showed normal fertility. Harlan had never disclosed this. Not to Caroline, not to his family, not, apparently, To the legal team currently arguing that Caroline's pregnancy was medically implausible within the marriage. Second, when Caroline's pregnancy was confirmed through Dr. Rowe and the information reached Theodore, Theodore had moved immediately. He had called Walter Crane. He had updated the estate documentation. He had also, through a trusted intermediary, ensured that Caroline received certain information at a foundation event. The gray-haired man she had spoken to, briefly, the conversation that seemed like small talk. He wasn't making small talk, Griffin said. I know that now, she said. Third, Judith Voss had been told about the codicil by Theodore himself, and Judith had told Harlan. She had done it because she was afraid of losing her son's approval. The way she had been afraid of losing it for 50 years. But Judith also had in her possession a letter, a personal letter from Theodore, written for the child Caroline was carrying, a letter Harlan did not know about. Caroline was quiet for a moment. Judith has a letter from Theodore addressed to the baby, she said. Yes. And she hasn't given it to Harlan. Not yet. Why not? Griffin looked at her steadily. Because she's been watching what he's done. The press, the medical records, what he did to Walter Crane. He paused. She hasn't been able to bring herself to help him anymore, but she also hasn't reached out to you. She's waiting for someone to give her a reason. That's what I think, he said. He left at 9:30. She walked him to the door, and she thanked him in the formal way she had learned to thank people for things that were inadequate compared to the gift being given. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway with both hands flat against the wall. The wall was cool under her palms. The hallway was quiet. The baby moved in a slow, rolling wave from right to left, the sensation she had come to think of as her daughter stretching. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor. Not because she was defeated. She was not defeated, but because she was overwhelmed in the specific way that comes from understanding all at once how thoroughly you have been managed, not just by Harlan, by a whole structure of people and decisions and small strategic moves that had treated her like a variable to be accounted for rather than a person to be respected. Even Theodore, who was trying to help her, who was genuinely on her side, had moved her around the board. She had been the last person to understand the game she was in. The floor was hardwood and cold through her dress. The lamp in the living room cast a warm square of light down the hallway. She could hear the heat cycling in the building, the low mechanical breath of it. She sat there for 7 minutes. Then she got up. She went to her desk in the small room she used as an office. She opened her laptop. She began writing a letter, not to Margaret, not to Walter Crane's attorneys, to Walter Crane himself. By hand, but drafted on screen first so she could get the words right. She wrote, I'm not asking you to do anything you don't believe is right. I just wanted you to know that what Theodore did in his final months was one of the most generous acts anyone has ever extended toward me. You helped him do that. I wanted someone who was present for it to know that it mattered. She wrote it 3 times before she had the version she wanted. She printed it. She signed it. She addressed the envelope. She thought, this is not strategy. This is just the truth. And sometimes the truth is the only thing that works. The tabloids picked up the story on a Thursday. The headline read, Voss divorce turns heir drama. There was a photograph of Caroline leaving the courthouse, one hand on her belly, face unguarded. She looked tired in the photograph. She looked like a woman carrying more than a pregnancy. She looked, she thought, when Nora showed it to her, like exactly who she was. There was a quote from a source described as close to the Voss camp. The quote said that Caroline was a woman who had gotten pregnant strategically when she saw the marriage failing. It was Delia. The phrasing was unmistakably Delia. Nora wanted to hire a publicist. Margaret wanted a formal statement. Caroline said nothing for a full day. She went to her prenatal appointment instead. Dr. Sandra Rowe's office was warm and unhurried, which was the specific quality of Babbitt that Caroline had come to rely on over these months. The ultrasound room smelled faintly of the gel warming in its dispenser. The machine made its specific low hum. On the screen, in the grainy gray of ultrasound imaging, her daughter moved with the calm of someone who did not yet know about tabloids, or prenuptial agreements, or family trusts. 33 weeks, healthy, well-positioned, strong heartbeat. Dr. Rowe completed the measurements, and then she set the transducer down and she placed her hand briefly on Caroline's arm. She said, "You've been carrying a lot. She's doing beautifully, so are you, even when it doesn't feel that way." Caroline nodded. She said thank you in the careful voice she had been using for everything lately. The voice designed not to let anything through that she wasn't ready to release. She held it together through the lobby and through the parking structure elevator, and until she was inside her car with the door closed. Then she put her forehead against the steering wheel and she cried. Not panicked crying, not despairing crying. The specific crying that happens when someone says something kind at exactly the moment you are most trying to hold together. The release of it. The 5 or 6 minutes of it that took the pressure off so you could go back to carrying everything. She sat in the parked car afterward with the engine off, hands in her lap, unable to drive yet, unable to go back in for the ultrasound printout she had left at the reception desk, just sitting in the stillness of the parked car while the world moved around it. 6 minutes. Then she went back inside for the printout. She was driving home when the rage arrived. Not the cold clarity she had been operating in for weeks. This was different, warmer, more combustible. She was on the highway, radio off, hands correctly placed on the wheel, and she thought about Harlan's team subpoenaing her prenatal records. The ultrasound appointments she had attended alone because Harlan had stopped coming by month 3. The appointments where the technicians always asked, in the practiced, careful way of medical professionals, "Is your partner going to join us today?" And she had said, "No, he's traveling, he's in meetings, he has a conflict." Every time with a different excuse, every time with the same interior flinch. He had never come, and now his attorneys were using those records as a weapon. She pressed her hands tighter on the wheel. She thought, "I did not plan this pregnancy. I found out I was pregnant, and I cried for 2 days, because the man I was still, stupidly in love with, had just filed for divorce. I cried for 2 days, and then I made a decision to protect my daughter with everything I had. That is the entire story. He does not get to rewrite that." She pulled into the townhouse garage. She sat in the car for one more moment. She was not going to be angry for long. Anger was expensive, and she had a lot left to do. But she was going to let herself feel it fully right now, in this car, before she went inside. She felt it. Then she got out of the car. Margaret called that evening. Her voice was careful in the way it got when she was managing information she knew would land hard. "Harlan's team found Walter Crane," she said. "They got to him first. Preston Alcott traveled to Vermont personally. He spent 4 hours with Crane." A pause. "Crane has signed a statement saying he had doubts about Theodore's mental clarity at the time of the codicil signing." Caroline was standing at the kitchen counter. She went very still. "He signed a statement," she said. "Yes." Preston Alcott sat with an 81-year-old man who just lost the person he had worked alongside for 50 years. He sat with him for 4 hours. She stopped. She started again. And Walter Crane said he doubted Theodore's mental clarity. That's what the statement says. She put the phone down on the counter without ending the call. She stood with both hands flat on the granite. The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, the wind was picking up. She picked the phone back up. "Margaret," she said, "I already sent him a letter." "What kind of letter?" "A personal letter. I told him what Theodore's act meant to me. I didn't ask for anything. I didn't mention the case." She paused. "I just told him the truth." Margaret was quiet for 4 seconds. "When did you send it?" 3 days ago, by post." "Then we wait," Margaret said. Caroline nodded, even though Margaret couldn't see it. She put the phone down. She thought, he turned an 81-year-old grieving man. He sat in his living room, and he turned him. She thought, of course he did. This is who Harlan is. This is who he has always been. I just kept explaining it away for 9 years. She ran a bath. She did not get in. She sat on the edge of the tub, in her clothes, and watched the steam rise from the water. The bathroom smelled like the lavender soap Nora brought. The mirror had fogged. She could hear, faintly, traffic on the street outside. She sat there until the water cooled. Then she drained the tub, stood up, and went back to her desk. She did not sleep well. Not badly, exactly, but the way late pregnancy imposes its own terms on rest. Shallow, interrupted, the body always negotiating between discomfort and exhaustion. She woke at 2 and lay on her side, in the dark, and her mind ran the case from beginning to end the way it always did at this hour. Not anxiously, methodically, like taking inventory, making sure everything was where it needed to be. She checked her phone at 2:15. She put it face down. She checked it again at 2:40. She put it face down again. She lay on her back for a few minutes. Witch doctor. Roe had gently discouraged, but which was the only position that made her lungs feel like they had enough room. The ceiling was a flat pale white in the dark. The baby was still. She thought about Judith Voss. She had been thinking about Judith Voss for 3 days, carefully, from many angles. Judith was 74 years old. She had been married to Theodore for 51 years. She had built her life inside the Voss family structure the same way Caroline had built hers. Except Judith's structure was the original one, and she had never had reason to question it. You don't question the house you grew up in. You just live in it. Theodore had told Judith about the codicil. Theodore had written a personal letter for the grandchild. And Judith had told Harlan about the codicil because Harlan was her son, and she was afraid of his anger, and she had been making decisions based on that fear for 50 years, but she hadn't given him the letter. That was the detail Caroline kept returning to. She hadn't given him the letter, which meant she was holding something back, which meant there was some part of Judith Voss that was not entirely aligned with what Harlan was doing. She needed to find that part. She made the decision at 3 in the morning. She was going to call Judith directly, not through attorneys, not through Griffin, directly. The way she had called every Sunday morning for 9 years when she was still Harlan's wife, on the house line, after church. She called at 9 in the morning. Someone she didn't recognize answered. She said, "This is Caroline. I need to speak with Judith." A pause, then Judith's voice, careful, unreadable, the voice of a woman who had not yet made a final decision. "Caroline," Judith said, "I've been wondering if you would call." The house was 40 minutes outside the city, Georgian colonial. The kind of house that had belonged to one family long enough to look like it grew from the landscape, rather than was built on it. Caroline had driven this road many times. She had never stopped finding it beautiful and also slightly forbidding. Judith met her in the morning room. It was the smaller room. Not the formal parlor, not the library. The morning room, with its 2 chairs and the writing desk and the window looking out to the garden. The choice meant something. This was a private conversation. Tea appeared. Neither of them touched it for several minutes. They sat across from each other in the 2 chairs. Judith in her upright, composed way, Caroline with her hands folded over her belly. 2 women in a room that smelled like old wood and dried flowers. Judith spoke first. "You know Harlan is going to find out you came here." "I know," Caroline said. "He'll use it against you somehow. He's already using everything else. I don't have a lot left to lose." Something crossed Judith's face. Just briefly. It was not warmth exactly, but it was the look of someone who has just revised their assessment of a person they had been underestimating. "He's my son," Judith said. It was not an apology and not an explanation. It was simply a fact she was acknowledging. "I know," Caroline said. "I'm not asking you to stop loving him. I'm asking you to let Theodore's wishes stand." Judith looked at the window for a moment. Then she opened the drawer of the writing desk beside her chair. She took out an envelope. Cream paper, heavy stock, sealed with wax and Theodore's personal seal. On the front, in his handwriting, "For the child." She placed it on the small table between them. She did not hand it to Caroline, not yet. "He wrote this when the doctors told him he had 4 months, Judith said. "He told me, 'Give this to Caroline when the time is right.' I asked him what the right time was." She paused. "He said I'd know it." But the room was very quiet. The garden outside was bare with November. The tea steamed gently. "I was going to give it to Harlan," Judith said. "I was going to let him decide." "What changed?" A long pause. "He turned Walter Crane," Judith said quietly. "Walter Crane worked for Theodore for 50 years. He was at our wedding. He was there when Harlan was born." She stopped. She looked at her hands. Theodore would be ashamed. She slid the envelope across the table. Caroline picked it up. She held it in both hands. The wax seal was pressed deep. Her name was not on the envelope. Her daughter's name was not on it. It said, "Only for the child," as though Theodore had known she would understand. "I was there when he signed the codicil," Judith said. "He was entirely himself, sharp as ever. Anyone who says otherwise is lying." She met Caroline's eyes. "I will say so in court if you can get me on the stand." Caroline held the envelope. She thought about 9 years of Sunday phone calls with this woman. She thought about the small slights, the occasional coldness, the way Judith had sometimes made her feel like a temporary addition to the permanent structure of the Voss family. She thought about all the ways she had wanted Judith to be warmer, and Judith had never quite been. She didn't need Judith to be warm. She needed Judith to be honest. "Thank you," she said. Judith nodded once. Neither of them reached for the tea. On the drive home, Caroline made 3 wrong turns. She was not paying attention to the road in the way that she should have been. She was thinking about the weight of the envelope on the passenger seat. She was thinking about Theodore's handwriting on the front of it. She was thinking about a man who had spent the last year of his life quietly constructing a protection for a grandchild he would never hold. She turned into a gas station parking lot she didn't need. She put the car in park. She picked up the envelope and held it in her lap with both hands. She did not open it. Not yet. She just held it. The gas station was brightly lit in the gray November afternoon. Someone in the next car was playing music that thumped against her windows. She sat there for 4 minutes, and she held the envelope, and she was, for the first time in months, not afraid. Walter Crane's letter arrived on a Wednesday. Not to Margaret's office, to Caroline's, to the townhouse by post, in an envelope with a Vermont postmark. She was standing in the hallway when she took it from the mail. She opened it there, still in her coat. He wrote in the careful longhand of a man who had spent his career constructing precise documents and applied that same precision to personal correspondence. He wrote that he had read her letter several times. He wrote that he was 81 years old and had never, in 50 years of practicing law, done anything he was ashamed of until last month. He wrote that Theodore Voss's senior had been, at the time of the codicil signing, as mentally clear and deliberate as he had been at any point in their 50-year association. He wrote that he had been feeling unwell during Preston Alcott's visit, that the pressure of the meeting and the weight of his grief had made him doubt his own memory in ways he no longer doubted. He wrote that he was prepared to revise his statement in writing and by video deposition if needed. He wrote, at the end, "Theodore told me she was a good woman. He was right." Caroline read the letter once. She folded it carefully and put it inside her coat against her chest. She stood in the hallway of the townhouse for a moment. She thought, sometimes the truth is the only thing that works. She called Margaret. Margaret received the news in the particular silence of someone absorbing information that changes the shape of everything. Then she said, in a voice that was trying very hard not to sound victorious, "He's changing his statement." "Yes." "The codicil is authenticated." "Yes." "And Judith Voss is our voluntary witness." "Yes." Another pause. "Caroline," Margaret said, "I need you to know something. In 22 years of practice, I have had perhaps 3 clients who moved through a case the way you have moved through this one. I just want to say that before we go into that courtroom." "Don't say it yet," Caroline said. "Say it after." She baked the lemon pound cake that night. Her mother was coming for the hearing. Her mother would bring food. There was no practical reason to bake, but she needed to do something with her hands that was warm and purposeful and had a defined endpoint. The recipe was her mother's. She had memorized it at 12 years old in a kitchen that smelled exactly the way this kitchen smelled right now. Butter and lemon zest and something beneath that, indefinable, that meant home. The radio was on. An oldies station, something her father used to play on Sunday mornings when she was small. She moved around the kitchen slowly, the way late pregnancy imposed its terms on everything, measuring and stirring and checking the oven temperature. The cake was slightly overbaked when it came out. She could tell by the color of the crust. She set it on the rack to cool anyway. It was fine. Not perfect. Fine. She thought that was appropriate. The morning of the hearing, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror again. Not as long as she had stood there 4 months ago. She knew what she would see, and she was ready for it. The circles under her eyes, the weight of 36 weeks, the specific face of a woman who had been in a long fight and was almost at the end of it. She looked at herself for about 30 seconds. She thought, I did not fight this hard for a settlement number. I fought this hard so she never has to wonder if her mother stood up for her when it counted. That is the whole reason. That is all of it. She put on the navy maternity dress she had bought specifically for this day. She put on her flat shoes. She picked up her bag. She checked her phone once before she left the house. Just once. She put it in her bag. She went downstairs. She opened the front door, and the November air came in cold and bright, and she walked out into it. Margaret was waiting outside the courthouse. She looked at Caroline as she approached, and she said, When we walk in there, they will look at that belly, and they will see either your weakness or your strength. That choice belongs entirely to them. Your job is simply to walk in. Caroline nodded. She thought about the lobby 4 months ago, the marble, the cold, the sound of Delia's covered mouth laugh and Preston's unrestrained one. She thought, They had been looking at the most important thing in the room and laughing at it. Let them look again. She went in, the same marble floors, the same cold air, the same bodies filling the same seats in the same configuration. Preston at his table, Harlan beside him, composed, silver-templed, hands folded, Delia in the gallery, in something dark blue this time, the court reporter at her machine, Judge Harwick in her chair, and Caroline at her table beside Margaret, both hands placed flat before her, 36 weeks pregnant, the navy dress, the flat shoes, and every piece of evidence they had assembled over 3.5 months in the briefcase beside Margaret's chair. She was ready. Preston opened. He was less theatrical than last time. He had been recalibrating. She could see it in the tighter structure of his argument, the places where the flourishes had been trimmed back. He argued methodically against the codicil's validity. He argued Theodore's mental decline. He argued Caroline's premeditation. He presented the Foundation Gala photographs with the dates clearly visible. He said, "The evidence shows a woman who systematically and deliberately positioned herself to exploit an aging man's estate." He said it carefully. He said it without humor. He sat down. Margaret stood. She presented Walter Crane's revised declaration first. Theodore Voss Sr. was fully mentally competent at signing. He had been clear, deliberate, and completely consistent with the man Walter Crane had known for 50 years. Margaret submitted the declaration. Preston objected. The judge overruled him. She called Judith Voss. Judith walked to the stand with the composure of a woman who had spent 74 years never appearing uncertain in public. She sat. She folded her hands. She looked directly at the judge. Margaret asked her to describe the codicil signing. Judith described it. She described Theodore's clarity. She described his deliberateness. She described the way he had spoken about the codicil afterward, with the satisfaction of someone who had completed something important. She described his exact words on the subject of his grandchild. She said, "Theodore told me that the child Caroline was carrying was the Voss heir. He told me he intended for her to be protected. He told me he had made certain of it." Preston rose for cross-examination. He asked Judith whether she had been pressured by Caroline to testify. Judith turned to look at him. The pause lasted 4 seconds. She said, "No." One word, delivered in the exact voice of someone who has never in her life been pressured by anyone and finds the suggestion faintly absurd. Preston moved on. He did not improve his position. Margaret submitted Griffin Cole's written declaration. The fertility retest. The documented medical fact that Harlan Voss was fertile 18 months into the marriage, that the original infertility diagnosis had been incorrect, that biological paternity had never been medically impossible. Preston argued to exclude it, denied. Margaret submitted Dr. Rowe's statement clarifying the improper scope of the prenatal records subpoena. The judge noted it. The note was mild in language and significant in everything else. Then Margaret held up the letter. For the child. Cream paper. Theodore's seal. She said this was personal correspondence from the deceased patriarch, written in the final months of his life, addressed to the child Caroline Merritt Voss, carried. She requested it be entered as evidence of Theodore's explicit and documented intent regarding his grandchild. Preston argued, personal correspondence, inadmissible. The judge said she would review it in chambers. The recess lasted 22 minutes. Caroline sat at the table and did not speak. Margaret sat beside her and did not speak. The courtroom hummed with the low activity of waiting. Harlan, across the room, sat very still. She did not look at him directly. She was aware of him in the peripheral way she had trained herself to be aware of him over the past months. Present but not given power, she placed both hands on the table. She looked at the grain of the wood. She stayed there, in that stillness, For 15 seconds, while the noise of the courtroom moved around her, she thought, "I am ready for whatever comes next." The judge returned. The letter was entered into evidence. Margaret looked at Caroline once, just briefly. Judge Harwick's ruling took 24 minutes to deliver. She read it in the measured cadence of someone who understood that every word would be examined and quoted and referenced for years. The relevant portions arrived in order. The codicil was valid. Theodore Voss, Sr.'s mental competency was established by corroborating testimony from 2 independent witnesses. The heir provision of the Voss family trust was therefore active. Caroline Merritt Voss, as the confirmed bearer of the first biological Voss heir, was the protected party under the trust's founding terms. The prenuptial agreement's fixed settlement clause was superseded. The Voss estate trust would be administered with Caroline's child recognized as primary beneficiary under Theodore's original and documented intent. The room went quiet, not the artificial quiet of a space waiting to react. The real quiet of people who had just heard something that closed a door they had believed would stay open. Harlan's legal architecture, the holding companies, the careful structures, the layered protections he had built over decades, had never been impenetrable, because Theodore had always kept a door. Theodore had always kept it, and in the last year of his life, he had ensured that Caroline knew where it was. She let out a breath. It was not a dramatic breath. It was not the breath of triumph or relief or joy. It was the simple breath of a person who has been holding something for a very long time and has finally been given permission to set it down. She had walked into that lobby 4 months ago, and they had laughed at her. She had walked in anyway. Margaret was already organizing documents. She did not celebrate in courtrooms. Neither did Caroline. They sat at the table as the room began to move around them, as Preston spoke quietly to his associates with the controlled expression of a man absorbing a loss. As Delia in the gallery checked her phone, Caroline looked straight ahead. She thought, Theodore built the door. Judith opened it. Walter Crane came back. Griffin kept his promise, and I walked through. 3 weeks later, the boxes in the hallway were gone. Not all the unpacking was done. There were still things in the second bedroom she had not sorted. There were still decisions to make about furniture and pictures and all the small objects that accumulate in a life and need to be assigned their permanent places. But the hallway was clear. The kitchen was settled. The books were on their shelves. The nursery was finished. She had done the last of it 2 weeks ago in the long, quiet evenings after the hearing when the legal machinery was running in Margaret's capable hands, and Caroline had nothing left to do but wait for her daughter and make the room ready for her. Cream walls. The rocking chair her mother had shipped from home, a white crib positioned to catch the morning light from the east window, a shelf she had taken her time with. On the shelf, a photograph of Theodore Voss Sr. in his 40s, standing in front of the estate house in summer, laughing at something outside the frame. She had found it in a box of photographs Judith had sent over without explanation, packed carefully in paper, addressed only to Caroline. Her daughter deserved to know who he was. She deserved to know that someone had loved her and protected her before she even arrived. Beside the photograph, in a simple frame, a copy of the codicil, 2 pages, dense legal language, the signature at the bottom in that bold, slightly trembling hand, and on a small folded card, leaning against the frame, in Caroline's handwriting, "You were wanted. You were worth every single thing." Nora came over on a Sunday afternoon. She brought a bottle of sparkling water because alcohol was still off the table, and coffee made Caroline's hands shake, and she sat at the kitchen table while Caroline sliced the lemon pound cake she had made again. This time correctly, not overbaked. The crust was the right color. The inside was dense and bright. Better than last time, Nora said. I was distracted last time. Understandably. Nora took another bite. How are you sleeping? The way you sleep at 37 weeks. So badly, but with the comfort of knowing it gets worse before it gets better. Exactly. They ate in the quiet that belongs to people who have been through something together and no longer need to narrate it. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window and fell across the table in a long, pale stripe. Outside, the November wind had given way to something colder and cleaner. The first week of December. Later, in the nursery, Nora sat on the floor cross-legged, the way she had sat on floors since they were in college. Caroline rocked slowly in the chair. The baby was low and heavy now. Every day brought the increasingly specific physical sensation of imminence, the body preparing for what came next in ways that were involuntary and ancient and required no decision from her at all. The room was quiet. The rocking chair made its small sound. Nora looked at the shelf, at the photograph of Theodore. Do you think he knew she would be a girl? Nora asked. I think he hoped, Caroline said. The trust language uses she-ko. It might have been coincidence. It might not have been. Nora nodded. She looked at the card in Caroline's handwriting. She read it without saying anything about it. The rocking chair moved. Caroline said, I spent 9 years making myself smaller so there would be more room for him. I thought that was what love required. She paused. I thought accommodation and love were the same thing. Nora waited. They're not the same thing, Caroline said. Accommodation is just accommodation. It doesn't require love, and it doesn't produce it. Love should make you larger, not smaller. It should make you more of who you are, not less. Nora was quiet for a moment. That is the most profound thing you have ever said, she said. I've had 8 months to think about it. It shows. The afternoon light in the nursery went gold the way it does in early December, low and warm and brief. It moved across the cream walls and the crib and the shelf with Theodore's photograph. It turned the room into something that looked, for a few minutes, lit from inside. Caroline thought about the lobby. She had been thinking about it at odd moments, for weeks, not obsessively, not painfully, with the particular clarity that comes when enough time has passed to understand a moment rather than just feel it. The cold marble, the sound of Delia's covered mouth laugh, Preston's unguarded amusement, all of them looking at her belly and seeing a weakness, a liability, a woman who had gotten herself into a situation she could not manage. They had been looking at the most important thing in the room, and they had laughed. She had walked in anyway. That was the whole story, really, reduced to its most essential elements. She had walked in anyway. She had kept walking. She had done every next thing that was required of her, not because she was not afraid, not because she was not exhausted, not because some days didn't feel impossible, but because her daughter was watching from the inside. Because someday, her daughter would be old enough to understand what had happened in this year. And Caroline wanted that version of the story, the one her daughter would carry, to be the true one, the one where her mother didn't flinch. Outside the courtroom, the day of the ruling, Harlan had stopped her in the marble hallway. He had stood 10 feet away, and they had looked at each other for the first time in months, without lawyers between them. He said, I didn't know about the codicil, not at first. She said, I know. He said, when I found out, I should have. He stopped. She said, yes, you should have. A pause stretched between them, long enough to hold 9 years in it. Not comfortably, but honestly. She said, She's going to be well taken care of. Your daughter, I'll make sure of that. She looked at him clearly. That's not the same thing as forgiving you, but I wanted you to know. She had not waited for his response. She had walked to where Nora and Margaret were standing, and Nora had immediately started crying, which was Nora's standard response to large emotions, and Margaret was already on her phone, and the marble floor was the same marble floor it had always been, and the air was still too cold, and none of it mattered at all. In the nursery now, the gold light faded, the rocking chair moved. Caroline placed her left hand on her belly, on the side where the baby most often pressed outward, the place she had come to think of as her daughter's preferred spot for making herself known, as though on cue, a pressure, distinct and deliberate, a small foot. The heel of it, Dr. Rowe had explained, was probably what she felt, pushing against her palm from inside. Like a knock. Like, hello, like I'm here. She pressed back gently. She said out loud to the cream-walled room and the December light and the photograph of Theodore on the shelf and the person who would soon be in the crib, I know, I've got you. The rocking chair moved, the light went soft, and the door that Theodore had built and Judith had finally opened, and Caroline had walked through at 34 years old and 8 months pregnant and entirely alone and entirely ready. That door remained open behind her. Not a door back to what she had lost. A door forward to what was being built. She had made it this far carrying everything. The hardest part of what came next was that she got to set most of it down. She rocked. The room was quiet. Her daughter knocked again, just once, and Caroline laughed. A small, private sound, the laugh of a person who has been through enough to know that this is the part worth keeping. And she said, I hear you, I'm right here. I'm right. I've been right here the whole time. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.